I'd like to take a few moments today and look at how to respond to personal hurt. We're going to do so by starting with an illustration found in 1 Samuel chapter number 18. I want to read a few verses for you, starting in verse number 5. David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. It came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that would be Goliath, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. The women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. It came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand as at other times. There was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. We have this story of David, just a young person now. This is taking place, of course, right after the slaying of Goliath. But even prior to the situation with the giant Goliath, David had been called in to play the harp in Saul's court. And Saul, of course, was overcome with an evil spirit. He had rejected God. He had been filled with pride. He had begun to search after witches and other things to call back the dead. He wanted Samuel back and had averted to evil means to do that. And Saul's heart was far from God, and he was overcome with an evil spirit, and it affected his demeanor, it affected his character, it affected his whole well-being. And so they had called in this young harpist to play music for him when he was in these bad moods. And it was David. David was talented in that very art of playing the harp. David had played the harp when the situation with Goliath had escalated and the Philistines were on the doorstep. David had been sent home for a time. David went back to watching the sheep. Saul and his armies had encamped there in the valley. As they were fighting Goliath, David had been sent down by his dad to check on his brothers. Of course, he had killed Goliath. And now here he is back with Saul, back in this extraordinary time when he has an elevated level with Saul. He's now, of course, well known. He's a hero in the country, and we see that by the way that these ladies are singing as they travel through from town to town. They love Saul, but they really love David, and Saul knows that, and Saul is overcome with that. He's infuriated by that. He figures the next thing the people are going to want to do is make him the king. Little, of course, does he realize that indeed David will be the next king. God had already determined that. But here is Saul in the court. He's overcome with an evil spirit as we come to chapter 18. David is there faithfully playing the harp as he always does. Saul decides the best thing he can do is eliminate this threat, David. And so as David is playing the harp, Saul picks up his javelin, his spear that's sitting beside him, and he throws it at him. Narrowly misses David. It hits, of course, the wall. He avoids the javelin that's been thrown at him. Isn't it interesting that we find that David, of course, it happens more than once. He comes back and he faithfully continues to play the harp for King Saul. I don't think any of us have probably too much of a fear or concern of an actual spear or javelin being thrown our way, but clearly we have problems with hurt and people lashing out, people that want to hurt us with their words, with lies, with things like that. The Bible, I think, here gives us a real good example of how to respond in the midst of those type of situations. And so I want to look very quickly at the proper response to personal hurt. Proper response to personal hurt. We see, number one, David did not respond himself with a spear. When Saul had thrown the spear at David, David did not pull the spear out of the wall that had just missed him and say, aha, I got you now, big guy. I got the spear now. He didn't do that. David didn't show up later on with a spear of his own, saying, well, if you're going to be throwing spears at me, I think I'll arm myself on this side. When people are throwing spears of hurt our way, when they're throwing spears of lies, of things that are not true, of things that are just trying to be spiteful and hurtful, it is not our duty in the Christian life to throw back spears of our own, to go on the attack. It's to be faithful and to do what we are supposed to do. And David just kept playing the harp. He came back and played the harp again. Interesting second point here is that David came back. He came back a second time. I think most of us, once bitten, twice shy. If you're going to throw a harp at me, forget it. I'm not coming back. You're trying to kill me? I'm not doing anything to hurt you. That's often our response in hurt. We avoid. We get out. We just ignore. We don't go back in the situation. We don't talk to that person anymore if that's the way they're going to be. David came back and kept doing exactly what he had been doing before as if it had never happened. David came back a second time. David had to avoid a spear a second time. It was his wisdom, ultimately, that was feared, number 3. It wasn't the fact that he had armed himself with a spear. It wasn't the fact that he was a greater spear or javelin thrower than Saul. It wasn't the fact that he had killed the great and mighty Goliath. Those weren't the things that Saul ended up being afraid of. It tells us, in fact, in verse 15, we hadn't read that far, but verse 15, wherefore when Saul, King Saul, saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. So Saul became afraid of David's wisdom, his character, the person that he was. If we're going to get into a spear throwing match with words or accusations or anger or bitterness, well, we can go toe-to-toe with that for a while. But when the other person is responding in wisdom and character and love, it's hard to know how to respond to that. Biblically, that's our role as a Christian, to respond with that type of love and that type of character, not to respond with a spear of our own. It's the wisdom that will catch people off guard. It's the character that will make a difference. And all that, of course, is what reflects Jesus Christ in our lives. Christ is our example. Luke 23, verse 34, as Jesus Christ is hanging on the cross, Jesus Christ said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. When they rained accusations down upon him, he did not respond in kind. Jesus did not lash back. He didn't call 10,000 angels. He didn't strike them dead with a wave of his hand. In fact, when Peter hastily and angrily cut off the ear of the guard that was arresting him in the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ lovingly put the ear back, healed the man. We are not to respond with spears of our own. We're to respond with the harp. We're to respond with character. We're to respond with wisdom. It's hard. It goes against our nature. It goes against our very personalities often. But we're not to respond with spears. We're to respond with a harp.